Start with or end with, let's say, a 20-pound dumbbell lateral raise, throwing it up, but really controlling that eccentric, and then superset that by dropping your weight to 10 pounds and then using control and going 3-0-1-1. And that's a great way to stimulate hypertrophy. What is tempo? Many of you, or hopefully all of you, have seen something like these numbers on your workout program or seen the word tempo. And a lot of people don't understand the importance of tempo or how much you can utilize tempo to get more out of your workouts, or even things like increased volume within your workouts, which I'll discuss later in this video. So with my programming for myself and my clients, you will see numbers like this. Now, I've seen quite a handful of other workout programs using numbers like this as well. So I'd like to think this is pretty universal. So I will explain all of these numbers and what they mean. So when we're looking at the first number here, this denotes the time spent lowering the weight or in the eccentric portion of the muscle. And so what that means is when the muscle is lengthening. So in a bicep curl, you're gonna be 1, 2, 3. Now, I don't expect anybody to physically count because that can be very distracting. Essentially, this just means control your movement as you are lowering that weight. The second number is gonna be denoted to the time spent at the end of the eccentric or at the end of when you have lowered that weight. So here we're gonna see there's no pause or anything. So 1, 2, 3, come right back up. Which leads us into the concentric portion of the movement, which is where the muscle is shortening, contracting. And then the last number here is going to be the number denoted to the time spent at the top of the movement or at the end of the concentric movement. So if we had like a 3-0-1-1, it'd be 1, 2, 3, 1, 1 kind of idea. So once again, tempo is super, super important, but also don't obsess or emphasize the counting, because then what happens is people end up going really slow through their movements or they get distracted by counting and stuff. Essentially what this is designed for is to control the movement and utilize it as a way to either increase stimuli by adding more volume or focusing more on specific portions of the range of the movement. So I'll give a couple examples of where we would use this to increase volume. So now a lot of people are aware that volume is a good driver, stimulator of hypertrophy, which means to build up of the muscle tissue in this context. And when you're looking at like calculating volume, a lot of people think it's just sets and reps, but you can use tempo to increase volume. And how you would do that is, let's say you have a bicep curl on one week. Instead of increasing sets and reps the next week, you can simply just add a 1-second pause to the end of that concentric movement. That is going to increase your volume because you are placing more time under tension with the muscle. So this is how I personally usually increase volume initially. I prioritize this over sets and reps depending on the program. For example, I don't necessarily want to always increase the eccentric portion because this is the most inflammatory portion, which yes, is very important for muscle building, but in most cases when people are not trying to build muscle, you don't want to place a lot of emphasis on this portion. You know, a standard 3 or 2 would suffice and bias more towards metabolic because it is less inflammatory compared to hypertrophy, for example. So another way you could increase volume is, let's say, you know, for a specific exercise, you could add a pause at the bottom of the movement, okay? So now, where you decide to put your pause is going to be important on the type of exercise that you are doing. And I'll explain that by, I'm gonna provide some videos within this video so you can get an idea of what I mean. But if you're doing a dumbbell bicep curl, you don't necessarily want to pause at the bottom. So as you see in the video here, when I'm at the bottom here, remember, dumbbell requires gravity, because when you're holding the weight like this, gravity is not feeding this way, it is feeding this way. So there's not a lot, if any, tension at the bottom of that bicep curl. Where you would maybe add a 1-second pause at the bottom of a dumbbell bicep curl is if you're trying to get somebody to slow their movement down. So if there's somebody who is really prone to just ripping through the movement, adding a pause here can help them control that movement a little more, possibly even improve their execution instead of them just throwing up the weight. So they have to take the time, pause at the bottom, and then they can control coming back up, keeping good form and execution, getting more out of that exercise. Realistically though, where you would bias a pause at the bottom is more towards a lengthened exercise. So what I mean by that is where the muscle is more biased towards stretching, lengthened. So like a barbell squat or a wrist height cable lateral raise, something along the lines of that. What I call a face away cable bicep curl. As you will see here, I've stepped out from the pulleys, so it's pulling back on me now, which is helping lengthen my bicep. So that is where I can take a pause to increase volume and time under tension. Once again, not really applicable or as efficient in something like a dumbbell lateral raise unless you want somebody to control their movement, okay? Barbell squat, wonderful time to hold a pause there, but keep in mind, adding more tempo here also means more inflammation, which I'm not demonizing inflammation in this instance. It's just keep in mind when you're programming for certain clients and trying to calculate volume and calculate recovery. So it's important to keep that context. Where we would maybe increase this one here is like, let's say you're going for like hardcore muscle building, you got tons of food, recovery is very optimal, and then you're doing something like a barbell squat and you really want to place a lot of time under tension. There's no point in adding more volume or increasing this tempo here in the concentric portion because the objective of a barbell squat is not the concentric portion, it's more of the lengthened portion. So we would maybe go 4-1-1-0 or something like that. Another thing you can do with the eccentric to work on like speed and strength and like power and strength is you can add like an X. And so what an X will mean is explosive. So you control that movement, come down nice and slow, take a pause at the bottom and then just explode back up, no pause at the top. That's a very good tempo for programming for muscle building. Even like strength training too, you would just lower the rep ranges essentially. Because remember, the reps are gonna equate to volume, time under tension. So that's a place where you would utilize more of the eccentric portion. Now where you would utilize more of the concentric portion would be on exercises that are biased more towards the shortened position, like a dumbbell lateral raise, or a leg extension, for example. So because once again, taking gravity into account, if you're doing a dumbbell lateral raise like you see in the video here, gravity is going down, not this way. So there's not a lot of tension at the bottom, which is another reason why I always recommend stopping here to keep slight tension on the medial delt, because then that way there's still a hair of gravity on that. But at the top here, as you can see in the video, that is going to place all of the load in the shortened position of the medial delt. So you could do something like 3-0-1-1 to increase time under tension and to increase volume there. And what you could also do is you could utilize tempo to utilize different resistances of the muscle when you don't have certain machines. So for example, a wrist height cable lateral raise, the cable is gonna be pulling, like you're gonna set it up at your wrist height and it's gonna be pulling this way. So that's adding tension down here. So that puts the medial delt in more of a lengthened position. But as you come up, the cable comes closer to your arm, so the tension dies off. Well, if you don't have access to cables, or if you're just not strong enough to use cables because they can be very heavy, even on the lowest weight, you can use a dumbbell exercise utilizing tempo in order to stimulate more of the lengthened portion. So what I mean by that is, what you will do is something like a 3-0-XO in a dumbbell lateral raise. So you'll come down, or sorry, let me backtrack. You will pick a weight that is gonna be too heavy for something like a 3-0-1-1 tempo. So let's say you do a 3-0-1-1 or a 3-0-1-0 for 12 reps. You do 10 pounds. Well, if you tried to do, if you tried to do that with 20 pounds, you're probably not gonna be able to do that unless you are using explosiveness and momentum because what's gonna happen now is you're biasing so much weight to the eccentric portion, you can stimulate a little more volume in that lengthened position of the medial delt using dumbbells. So a 3-0-XO would be a great way to do that. So like a little superset you could do is you could vice versa, but start with or end with, let's say, a 20-pound dumbbell lateral raise, throwing it up, but really controlling that eccentric, and then superset that by dropping your weight to 10 pounds and then using control and going 3-0-1-1. And that's a great way to stimulate hypertrophy. That's probably where I'd only use that for hypertrophy. I wouldn't use it for metabolic training or any of that kind of stuff because it can be very inflammatory. But that's another place that you can really utilize tempo. And same with like a leg extension. I wouldn't necessarily program an explode unless you are doing tremendous amount of weight because you need that explosiveness to get the weight up. But when you're looking at something like a leg extension or like a glute bridge, which is just a shorter version of the hip thrust, one big reason to program 3-0-1-1 is to not only, yes, utilize the potential of increasing volume and in creating more of a stimulus, but this goes back to people controlling their movement. So if you watch people in leg extension, they really just kick that weight up and they bounce back and forth. So by forcing them to take a pause at the top, they're gonna have better control of that movement, which is also gonna help them control that descent of the leg extension instead of just flailing through that kind of thing. Same with the glute bridge, right? Because people tend to just flail through hip thrust and glute bridge. So if you program a 1 at the top, that can actually instigate somebody to be like, okay, well, I'm pausing at the top, so that means I have more of, a mindset to control that lowering portion of that movement, so you're just not flailing through it. Because when you flail through the movements like that, that decreases time under tension. Now, there could be a time and a place for that. Once again, heavy amounts of weight, working on strength and power. But in terms of hypertrophy, you're gonna really wanna control that movement. So that's just a few ways that you can utilize tempo to not only increase volume, but improve the efficiency of each exercise, but also like for your safety, because if you're flying through movements, especially like barbell squat, like a lot of people in those movements will just drop, right? You really increase your risk of injury. There's always that potential injury aspect. Anything could happen, or they could just come down so fast that you can't physically bring the weight back up to as where if you had control with that movement. So that's another thing too, is to prevent injury. Because if you ever seen I've seen videos of guys tearing pecs and all this kind of stuff, and they're just hammering, not like their arms on the right place, but also they're just like flying through these movements. And in terms of hypertrophy, that's not gonna create the best stimuli because it's not a lot of time under tension. Once again too, maybe the purpose of explosiveness, you would go through fast, but with that being said, if you're ripping through that, you're not recruiting a lot of motor units. So that could take away from strength. And so tempo is super, super important. And a lot of people neglect tempo, or they don't read up on tempo or understand the importance of tempo. But I encourage you to really focus on what your program says for tempo. And as mentioned, you can use these numbers to utilize specific stimuli to increase volume, or simply just increase time under tension for that movement, or just learn that movement. So like another example is, I normally only ever do X for explosive, A for accelerate, or 1 for just come up with good control. I don't necessarily mean like 1, I just mean like come up in a controlled fashion, don't just throw it up. But there are times where you could do a 3-0-2-0 or a 2-0-2-0, and that could help increase metabolic stimulus. Now, to be careful though, because if you take too long, of a concentric portion, it can make it less effective, because then you're kind of like passing on to different motor units and such. So I don't normally program this a lot, but you can use this to increase volume in a metabolic stimulus. And then another thing too is like when you're looking at the eccentric, it doesn't always have to be 3, and it also doesn't always have to be higher than 3. You could do a 2, so like a 2-0-1-1, and where I would do something like that is, once again, glute bridge. Because the point of a glute bridge is only half of the movement of a hip thrust, because we're putting all the tension on the top portion of the glutes, right? It's not something that, oh, you're half repping it. That's the point of a glute bridge, is to only go halfway compared to a hip thrust. So by programming a 2-1-2, that can help, encourage the individual to not go too low. Because if you're doing a 3 count, they might go out of that range that you have for that desired movement. Same with like a glute leg press. Research shows going to 90 is great for the glutes when you are set up properly. That's a time where you could utilize that leg press. You could say, okay, I only want you doing 2011 or 2110 rather, because the leg press is a lengthened exercise. And so that is where you could utilize a 2-second tempo is in movements that you want them to be shorter, that you want that range of motion to be shorter. Or sometimes you do want them to go faster. So if you do have like a dumbbell lateral raise and you want that person to go faster because you want less time under tension because they're doing drop sets or something. So let's say you're doing a triple drop set. Once again, you can program a lot of volume this way, but keep the set going by going 3-0-1-1 for, let's say, 10 reps. And then you go 3-0-1-0 for the next 10 reps, and then you go 2-0-XO for the last 10. Because you're gonna be so fatigued, you're gonna need to go through faster and use explosive movements just to get through that exercise, those drop sets, right? So it's kind of turned into like some programming ideas, but it's just illustrating the importance of tempo and that you should be utilizing your tempo, not only for the opportunity to increase volume and get more out of your training, but for your safety as well.